Hello, my friends. As this age draws to its conclusion, we can look back over the past 6,000 years and, uh, and make better sense of what it has all been about. This has been the age of Adam. It has been the age of what I call Adamic consciousness, a state of consciousness that mankind has been moving in dominantly for this entire age. And Adam's consciousness, as I have spoken of many times before, has been clearly portrayed for us. We see that mankind during this age has held very true to the traits that Adam displayed in the Garden of Eden when he was transformed, that he immediately became knowledgeable about good and evil, that he saw life from that time forward through the lens of duality, that his entire perspective of life was no longer singular, it was binary. That he also felt a sense of separation. This was clearly portrayed. And this sense of separation, when we look back over the age historically, we see that mankind has never broken free of this sense of separation, but we have always been reacting to it, and that we have basically formed an orientation to life based on this sense of separation, an orientation in which every man and woman has to fend for themselves, and it's the survival of the fittest. And there's uh, there's no one but each one of us to make our own way. There's no one to help us. That is the orientation that grew out of the sense of separation, because the sense of separation pretty much made us feel like we were entirely on our own. And that's what we've been all reacting to over this entire age. So this is how the age began, and and there was also an element of evolutionary destiny at work. Adam awoke to his state of consciousness. He awoke to his endowment of consciousness. This was the beginning for human consciousness. There was a species called Homo sapien before Adam, but this species was more animalistic and without consciousness. It looked like us, but it was nothing really like us, because once consciousness awoke in Adam, we became pretty much an entirely different creature at that point. This age, therefore, there was a sense of destiny about it, because when Adam awoke, he awoke to this certain state of consciousness that was like a seed state of consciousness. It was an evolutionary plateau for mankind. And that's why we've stayed in it so long. It was a big plateau. And the destiny part comes in that we were, according to evolutionary law, we were destined to stay in this state of consciousness for as long as we have. This is simply an outworking of how consciousness works, that we were not immediately uh, Christ figures in the beginning. We did not awake to the Christ. We awoke to Adam. And then we had a whole age in front of us to work that out and to express Adamic consciousness. And so by the process of evolution, this was our destiny, because evolution is law, and destiny uh, gives way to law. And so when we look back, we see 6,000 years of human endeavor on the earth. Or sometimes it's also, it can be called the earthly plane of existence, because the earth is not just a physical environment. It's an environment that has been tailor-made to to be the environment of Adamic consciousness. That's why it's so full of challenges. That's why it's so full of dualities. There's darkness and there's light and there's heat and there's cold and etc. Everything on the earth reflects Adamic consciousness. So this is not just a physical environment, it's a spiritual environment also. And that, when we speak of the earthly plane, we're speaking of the earth as we know it as more than a physical environment, as an environment that was also made for consciousness, made for human beings to express their state of consciousness here. So we look back and we see human beings going forth into this plane in this new uh, in this new being, this new state of consciousness that we became, this new creature, and having our experiences on this plane. And we see that from the very beginning, Adamic consciousness took on a certain social quality, and it took on an outworking that has been very consistent for 6,000 years. We see that human beings were cast into this orientation of human strength and have never varied from that. And we also see that human beings have always uh, viewed life through the knowledge of good and evil. And that's what so much of our history is the story of, is the fight between good and evil. And there has been something else going on during this age, but it's been, relatively speaking, it's been quiet. It's been small. And I say that because the dominant tone of our civilization for these 6,000 years has clearly been Adamic, and it's clearly been a reality view based on Adam's consciousness. But the other thing that's been going on has been a visitation, sort of. It's been the reality of the Christ. And the Christ is, it's not a person. It's not, it's a state of consciousness also, but it's up ahead of us. It's also indicative of what we call the New Age. The Christ is mankind evolved into the next level of consciousness and the next awakening of consciousness. And clearly, this has not happened yet. It has not happened for 6,000 years, but there have been visitations. And we know of one very powerful visitation when Jesus was here. But when you think about it, that was 3 years that he was a public figure on the earth out of 6,000 years. So even though his testimony of the Christ was very powerful, it was, relatively speaking, it was like finding a needle in a haystack. But this was a visitation. This was the Christ consciousness. It was the Christ age visiting us in this age and saying, hey, look at me, pay attention to me because this is where you're headed. And in Jesus's case, it was even more than that. It was, write this down so that you have a written testimony of it for the rest of the age, because it was quite important. And the reason that it was important is this: the age of Adam has been an age of suffering and an age of darkness, spiritually speaking. It's been an age in which many people have felt hopeless, despaired of goodness, of life's goodness. And it's been a very difficult time for many, many, many people. And so the Christ visitation was meant to give us hope. And this was very important because without this, without the Christ visitations, because there have been others besides Jesus, without the Christ visitations in this age, mankind would pretty much have gone the way of complete evil, so much sold to evil that the light of life was blotted out in the human world. And that's why Jesus said, I am the light of the world. His testimony of the Christ was so powerful that it established a light in our dark world for all of us to be able to hope in the age of the Christ that is to come. So let's look back now and look at some of the other testimonies of the Christ, because there have been others. And mostly the problem has been that there have been testimonies, visitations since the beginning of the age, but of course we didn't really have record of those earliest visitations. We only had what could be called a verbal testimony handed down from generation to generation. And you know how that goes, that from one person to the next, from one generation to the next, the verbal uh, transmissions tend to get sort of twisted up. But there have been, beginning about 4,000 years ago, there have been written records. And one of the first things that our earliest written records did was that they included some testimony of the earliest verbal transmissions. They included a story like the Garden of Eden story, or the story of Adam's sons, Cain and Abel, or the story of the flood when Noah went into his ark, or the story of the Tower of Babel. They included stories that when they actually happened, there was no written record of them. But when human beings started keeping historical records, there was a certain emphasis on retaining those verbal transmissions. So what we find is that we do have some kind of record of early um, testimonies to the Christ. But these testimonies have to, in order to for us to receive them, we have to be believers. We have to believe that they actually happened and that they were real. When the historical accounts begin, it's a little easier to believe, because we can see that somebody wrote this down and it actually must have happened. But so believing requires not a religious framework necessarily. It requires individual faith. It requires that each human being search their own heart and basically decide whether they want to believe. And that has, there are many factors that bring about this decision, one of which has to do with suffering. If we've suffered in life, we will be much more drawn to the testimony of the Christ, because the testimony of the Christ is that there is an age coming when human suffering is no longer going to be extant. So believing has to do with wanting to believe. And many Adamites throughout this age are not believers because they haven't wanted to believe. They're very happy with the way things are in this world, and they have no reason to want to believe in the age of the Christ. This age is just right for them, this age of Adam, and they're prospering here and they're doing just fine. So that rules out a lot of people right there. But those who suffer in this life and who want to believe have been greatly strengthened by the testimonies handed down to us, the testimonies of the Christ. And so we read in the Bible, which is a book that is historical, but also includes earlier testimonies, because that was a priority of Moses, who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, of the Old Testament. He made a point of including those early verbal transmissions only because it was clear to him that these were important testimonies to the Christ, to the age of the Christ. And so the Bible is a very important book for any human being who is looking ahead, who lives their life and feels drawn to the age of the Christ. The Bible is a very important book. It's the book of hope for us. And so we read in the Bible, we read of Cain and Abel in the very opening pages, the two sons of Adam, and we see that there's hardly anything written about Abel, but we see that there's quite a bit written about Cain, and it's clear that Cain became a prototype of what was to come for mankind, that he was very strong and that he went forth without any kind of faith in God or the Christ, completely independent, completely with his own strength as his faith, as his power, and he became. Cain was very much the kind of man that human society has bred over the age, and I sometimes call this the status quo of human society, but it's really it's been much more dominant than that even. It's been that Cain has been the prototype for Adamic man throughout this age. But even though not much is written about Abel, we can glean a certain testimony from his life that the Bible tells us about. We can glean that Abel was looking ahead to the age of the Christ, even though he was born at the very beginning of this age. That shouldn't mystify us too much, because the evolution of consciousness is such that even though human beings have been stuck in this state of consciousness that we call Adamic, there have always been human beings that could aspire to the Christ. There have always been human beings that have been spiritually motivated to become like the Christ, even during this age. And Abel was one of those. And so that shouldn't mystify us, that he, even though it was at the very beginning of this age, he had his heart set on the Christ. He had his heart set on the age to come. And he didn't know what this world was going to turn out to be. He thought that the age of the Christ could happen immediately, which is also interesting because that's what the disciples of Jesus thought, was that the age of the Christ was dawning when Jesus rose from the dead, that was it. That was the new age come. But it doesn't really matter because the testimony of the Christ is what matters. And so we see that Abel, having his heart set on the age of the Christ, was a powerful work in his life. It was him testifying that there will be a new age, that there will be the age of the Christ, and that everything that his brother embodied in terms of human strength and human Adamic mentality, everything that embodied uh, was not necessarily going to last forever. And so Abel became the first testimony of the Christ. His life became the first testimony of the Christ and the first light of the world. But then the Bible goes on to describe others. Um, of course, at the same time, it also says that the world was pretty much given over to the energy of Cain, of Adamic man, in the model of Cain. And but when we read of Noah and we read of the flood that came upon the earth and wiped out the entire population of Adamic man, we what we're hearing in Noah's life is also a testimony of the Christ. And this is simply the fact that Noah had his heart set on something better. He had his heart set on a new world. He looked around him and he saw the sin and he saw the darkness of man and he saw the hatred and the murder and violence, and he set his heart on the age of the Christ. And when he did that, he became receptive to the voice of God, to the word of God, to the impulse, the spiritual impulse within him that could instruct him as to how to live his life. And so we find him feeling instructed to build an ark. And as a prophet, we find him having a prophetic vision of the flood, and then going about his business of testifying by building the ark. And it took him a very long time to build the ark, and there were no oceans anywhere nearby, no bodies of water to sail his ark on. So it was really an act of faith. It was like people must have thought he was entirely crazy, which is also sort of a consistent view of all those who testified to the Christ. But Noah built his ark, and he, as the story goes, he was the survivor. He and a few others that entered into his ark were the survivors that repopulated the earth. But Adamic consciousness was still destined to work itself out in this age. And so that even that decimation of the earth's population didn't bring in the age of the Christ yet. So then we read in the Bible about the calling of Abraham, and we read about, and this is now in the historical period where mankind had actually begun keeping written historical records. So this is even more, has even more validity as a testimony that Abraham was a regular man who, of the race of Adam, of the consciousness of Adam, whose heart yearned for the new age, for the Christ, for something better than what he saw when he looked around him. But he had no vision for that. He had no hope for it. But his yearning, his heart condition, like it had done with Noah, it opened Abraham's perception to be able to hear instruction from the Spirit of God, and to respond to a divine impulse, a divine leading. And he did so in a quieter fashion than Noah. I mean, it was hard for Noah to hide his instructive impulse when he was building the ark, because it was like a crazy act to those around him. But Abraham heard a different word. It wasn't to build an ark, and it was simply to get up and get out, to leave the situation that he was in, and to do so quietly, not to draw a lot of attention to himself, but to go to a certain land where he could um, develop this sense of that his yearning had alerted him to the reality of the Christ, and he wanted to develop it. He wanted to, but he didn't feel that he could, where he was living previously in a more worldly setting. He felt that the energy of the worldly Adamic Cain society was too strong for him. So he went to a new land where he felt like this would be conducive in this land to developing this sense of the Christ. And as he did this, and as he had his offspring and family in this new land, they began to express the testimony of the Christ sort of out of nowhere. You know, it came through Abraham, and it came through his quiet spiritual impulse, and then he taught it to his sons, and and so there in the new land that they lived in, they did actually begin to develop this this actual manifestation, societal manifestation of the Christ on earth in the midst of our Adamic uh, age, when it was really going against destiny at that point. And because mankind was not yet destined for the Christ at that time, but man could feel the Christ like Abel had, and man could aspire to the Christ. That has always been within our potential during this age. And that's what Abraham did, and that's what he passed on to his descendants. And this is what later became the nation called Israel. And this became, in the very beginning, it became a national testimony. It was pretty amazing, because it was they weren't just testifying of religion, and they weren't just testifying of spirituality or of consciousness. They were testifying to the state of consciousness called the Christ. And that is why throughout their history as a nation, there arose prophets to actually testify to not only a new age of the Christ, but a figure that would come, that would be like Jesus, that would be the embodiment of the Christ. They had a vision of that. They foresaw it and they testified to it. And Moses, the man who led the nation out of Egypt back to the land that Abraham was told to go to, Moses was the he was a prophet, and he foresaw, he had a vision of Jesus and of the Christ visitation on earth. And this vision sustained him, and it made his own testimony of the Christ very powerful, and it, it made him into the leader of the nation and the spiritual shepherd of the people for even unto this day. And so we see others that followed, and most that we have a record of, most of them are associated with this nation of Israel. And there were the prophets, and there was King David that is written about in the Bible, who all of these had a very powerful experience of a vision of the Christ age to come. And some of them had a very specific vision about Jesus also. And the embodiment, the one human being that would embody the Christ and visit us. And there were others, though. This is the written record that we have in the Bible, but there were others in the East that had the same experience with the Christ, because human suffering has always been global, and it has always been, there's no boundaries that keep out human suffering. It's always been the same for every human being, East or West. And where there has been human suffering, there has also been an opening to be able to have the vision of the Christ and of the Christ age to come. And so in the East, we find a very rich tradition. There was a man who became what is called the Buddha, the enlightened one, a man from India. And Buddha was definitely a Christ figure. He was definitely a human being of the race of Adam who had an experience and the vision of the Christ age to come, and who gave his life to it so thoroughly that his own aspiring to be the Christ began and gained great traction during his life. He became very enlightened. He became a version of Adamic man that very few others have. And he also had followers. And then after him, there came many in the East that shared this great vision of the Christ age. So it was not just in the land of Israel, and it was not just in the Western world that this was happening. It was also going on in the East. When Jesus came, this was pretty much a global phenomenon. In other words, it was in a very specific location that he came to, and as far as we know, he never traveled or went or left that location. although there are some reports that say he traveled to the east when he was young. But when he turned 30 and he became a rabbi, able to teach publicly, what followed was 3 years of glorious ministry, of glorious experience, and it was local. It was all going on in the land of Israel, but there were others in the world that knew about it and later um, became very much drawn to this figure because he embodied the age of the Christ. He embodied the consciousness of that age that is to come and the consciousness that we now call Christ consciousness. And so it was a global or universal event when Jesus was here, but it was only 3 years. It was an extremely brief time, a brief visitation, and but it was powerful, and it was so powerful, in fact, that it spawned an apostolic age following his visitation, in which a couple of 100 years were filled with the light of the Christ, and the light of the Christ spread throughout the region. It broke out of its local confines and spread, and and of course, the most important thing was that there was a documentation that was very thorough about Jesus's life. It came from many different sources, human sources, historians, um, Jewish scholars, and of course, the apostles themselves. And it was written down because it was so powerful. And because it was written down, we have had um, the testimony of the Christ since then in our world, with almost no interruption. We've had the writings of the New Testament, and even though those writings became obscured from a lot of people for some time, um, they've always existed and they've always been passed down. And so Jesus was the embodiment of Christ consciousness. He was the greatest testimony of all. We have these other testimonies. We have the testimony of Abel and of Noah and of Abraham and Moses, but there was no testimony to compare to Jesus's, because he testified with authority. And what this means, what this shows us, is that the others who testified and who have testified of the Christ during this age testified as Adamic men with the yearning and the aspiration of the Christ, but without actually coming fully into that state of consciousness themselves. They were regular people who um, saw the Christ and who felt the Christ and who yearned for the Christ, and then went on to testify in their lives that this was coming, and it was something that was very important to all of us. But Jesus was more than that. Jesus was the actual embodiment of Christ consciousness. He had, and we'll never know exactly how this came to pass because he was a human being, but he had already come in to the state of consciousness of the Christ age. And it had become more than a yearning for him. It had become more than an aspiration. It was the fulfillment of Christ consciousness in him. And that was his testimony, was that not only is the age coming, not only can we aspire to it, we can do it. It's going to happen. His testimony was more than just faith. It was more than just yearning. It was the fulfillment, the acquisition, the attainment, the achievement of Christ consciousness. And so this was a very glorious time on earth. And that's why it was disappointing to realize that our destiny as Adamic conscious beings, having to go 6,000 years in this age, our destiny felt a little cruel after that. It's like, can't we just come into the Christ age now? But we couldn't, and it wasn't time. And so our world, after the apostolic uh, age, those few centuries that upheld and spread the Christ testimony so powerfully, after that, our world reverted to darkness again, to the works of Cain, and has been in that again ever since. And that was disappointing. But the testimony has never dimmed the testimony of Jesus, the testimony of the Christ. And this is something that has sustained mankind, because this age of Adam has been so dark and has been so hopeless in many, many ways. Mankind has been sustained by the vision of the age to come, of the Christ age, and by the visitation of Jesus himself, the embodiment of Christ consciousness. Each one of us who feel that who now live on this plane and put our hope in the Christ and in Christ consciousness, each one of us also testifies in our lives. And it's really interesting because the testimony of the Christ becomes not just something that we would, aspire to, or not just something that we feel like this would be nice to do tomorrow, or the testimony of the Christ is such that it consumes us. It consumes the regular human beings that we are in Adam when it comes upon us, when we gain a vision for who Jesus was and what he embodied, and all the others that have testified throughout this age, when we ourselves gain that vision of the Christ age to come, this testimony becomes impossible to deny. We have to live it because it's it just becomes a supernatural kind of phenomenon in our lives. It consumes us. Um, People who testify, who gain this calling to testify to the Christ age to come, these people lose all of what might be called normal human attachments. They go forth uh, without any great attachment to um, social human life, to career, to family. Nothing seems to be able to take hold of their life anymore, except the testimony of the Christ. It consumes people, and this is still happening to many people right now. I think especially because the age of the Christ is drawing near, and so we, all of us who are feeling this pull, find our lives um, without any attachment to anything else. We just can't help but testify in every breath, with every breath, that the age of the Christ is coming, and that it's going to be. We seek to get a vision for how it's going to be based on what Jesus showed us, and it becomes our entire focus of life. Um, so this is happening now with many people that are going forth into the world testifying about the Christ right now and about the age to come. And what's astounding is that these people have no um, normal life anymore. They have no what we've come to call normal. They have no attachment to the things that other people live for, and all they have is the testimony of the Christ. And yet they themselves feel completely fulfilled by this, and completely uh, elevated and energized by this. So it's a phenomenon that's happening here at the end of the age as we approach the age of the Christ, and as we can look back over the age that we were destined as a species to go through, um, and to make better sense of what it has all been about. And it is going to end, my friends. It is going to give way to the age of the Christ, because we can know this because of the cloud of witnesses that have seen it. Um, if it had just been one human being, um, for instance, if it had just been Abraham who saw it, um, we could say that he was crazy, that he was someone who had lost touch with reality, and this was his rant. But it's been much more than that. And you can't take away the testimony of Jesus. And this testimony is so powerful that it not only changed the world in our age, it guaranteed that the age of the Christ will come. And so that's our hope, and that's our glory.